The reading this morning is John 21, 1 through 14. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he showed himself in this way. Gathered there together were Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, and sons of Zebedee, and two others of his disciples. Simon Peter said to them, "I'm going fishing." They said to him, "We will go with you." They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, "Children, you have no fish?" They answered him, "No." He said to them, "Cast the net to the right side of the boat, and you will find some." So they cast it, and now they were able not to haul it in because there were so many fish. That disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on some clothes, for he was naked, and jumped into the sea. But the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from land, only about 100 yards off. When they had gotten ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there, with fish on it and bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you have just caught." So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore, full of large fish, 153 of them. And though there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now none of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" because they knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time that Jesus appeared to the disciples after he was raised from the dead.
Thank you, Betsy. So what is it? What is it with T-shirts and country music festivals? You may or may not recall, but on a Sunday last July, I mentioned that for the last several years now, I get my wife Cindy tickets to a different country music festival each year as her primary Christmas present. Okay. Those festivals generally involve 3 to 4 full days and evenings of almost nothing but country music. But it's all good. For one thing, country music is my wife's favorite kind of music, and I happen to love it too. But you know, it's not a bad thing because on the one hand, it makes shopping for her Christmas present each year a lot less complicated. And while it's not my favorite kind of music, I at least like it enough to find those 3 to 4 days bearable. There is one thing about those country music festivals that I do really enjoy each and every year. the t-shirts. For whatever reason, every year, wherever we are at these country music festivals, I come across a number of t-shirts that grab my attention, that either make me laugh or make me think, or sometimes both. Okay? Again, you may or may not recall, but when I talked about those country music festivals last July, we had just come back from one in Nashville, and I talked about the fact that while we were there, I had seen countless t-shirts with the word freedom on them, but not a single one with the word responsibility on it. Well, this year was no different. There were a number of t-shirts that grabbed my attention. Some of my favorites included one that had a picture of Bigfoot on it with the words, "World's Hide-and-Seek Champion." Okay, thought that was pretty good. There was one that said, "It's not my fault, I was left unsupervised," which was not worn by a child, by the way, but by a middle-aged man. Then there was another one that said, "My son-in-law is my favorite child." My mother-in-law had that t-shirt, wore it all the time. And then there was my favorite from this year's festival, which was a festival called Stagecoach in Southern California. It was a t-shirt that had a picture of Jesus on it with the words, well, you know what? I think I'll just show you. Yeah, I know, it's noisy. All right, let me see if I can get the mic over here. Okay. Picture of Jesus with the words, "Disappointment, all of you." Can you get a close-up of that, Renee, for the folks watching from elsewhere? I have to admit, the second I saw that t-shirt, I started laughing out loud. I was laughing out loud because I got the snarky and sarcastic intent behind it. I thought it was hysterical. But then a little while later, I started to think. I thought, I don't think the disciples would have found this t-shirt all that funny if Jesus had been wearing it, the risen Jesus had been wearing it, when they encountered him on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. Right before the scene that Betsy read from John's Gospel for us a few minutes ago, the writer tells us that the disciples have already experienced the risen Jesus twice. I believe Reverend Dr. Sally Haynes explored that scene a couple weeks ago while I was at that country music festival. They've already experienced the risen Jesus twice, already received the Holy Spirit from him, and already been reminded by him that just as God has sent him into the world, he is sending them out into the world. Out into the world to carry on his message and ways. But apparently that reminder doesn't sink in right away. Kind of like, hypothetically speaking, of course, when a wife asks a husband to go get or do something for her, and then when she asks him a couple of days later why he hasn't yet gotten or done what she asked, he says, "Oh, you meant right away?" Hypothetically speaking. The message, the reminder hasn't sunk in right away. Because while those disciples do go out, they don't go out to carry on Jesus' message and ways. Despite all the amazing stuff they have already experienced with the risen Jesus, they go out fishing. They go out fishing. Why? Why do they go out fishing after all that amazing, awesome stuff that they have experienced with the risen Jesus? Well, many scholars suggest that a primary reason that they go fishing is because despite all that amazing, awesome stuff that they have experienced with the risen Jesus, these still very human disciples are under a tremendous amount of stress. They are still under the very real, serious threat of hostility and persecution at the hands of the same Roman authorities who executed Jesus. Under that same threat because they are known to be Jesus' closest associates. And what research has consistently demonstrated is that when we are under stress, and especially significant stress, we have a tendency to respond by diving deeper into or reverting back to our most ingrained habits and behaviors, which for almost all of Jesus' disciples was fishing. What they had been doing all their lives before they went with him. But I also wonder if there isn't something else going on. If they also don't go back to fishing for another reason. Because they're stuck. Because they are stuck in a state of disappointment. Certainly, disappointment in themselves. Because again, despite all that amazing stuff that's happened since Jesus' death and resurrection, those encounters they've already had with the risen Jesus, those still very human disciples are still very much aware of how badly they let him down. Of how they betrayed, abandoned, and even denied knowing him when he needed them most. They must have felt a certain sense of disappointment in themselves. But also perhaps a different state of disappointment. A feeling, a belief that Jesus saw them as a disappointment. Saw them as a disappointment as disciples and maybe even as human beings. And so those stuck disciples go out fishing. Enter the deep symbolism, theological and spiritual symbolism that runs throughout John's gospel. Because what John does here is borrow, adapt a scene from Luke's gospel. A scene from early in Luke's gospel during Jesus' earthly life. John takes that scene and adapts it now, after Jesus' resurrection. Just like in that scene from Luke's gospel written about 15 years before John's gospel. So the writers of John's gospel would have been familiar with that text and that scene. And just like in Luke's gospel, the disciples are out fishing on the Sea of Galilee. John refers to it here as the Sea of Tiberias. That was the Roman name for the Sea of Galilee. But it's the same place. They're out fishing on the Sea of Galilee. Fishing all night, because that's how it was mostly done in that time. You fished at night. Out fishing all night and don't catch a thing. And again, just as in Luke's story, as daybreak approaches, the disciples sense a figure on the shore. They don't know, they can't tell who it is. But that figure tells them to cast their net to the right side of the boat. In John's symbolism, the right side meaning the side of Jesus and Jesus' ways. And then, just like in Luke's earlier story, those disciples catch a ridiculous amount of fish. Now, while Luke doesn't bother to offer us a number, John has no reservations about doing so. He tells us that they catch 153 fish. Not 150, not 160, not 155. 153 fish. What's up with that? Well, there's probably about 153 theories as to what's up with that. But the one that seems to make the most sense when we recognize John's underlying symbolism, as well as the fact that John's gospel, like all the others, was originally written in Greek, is that at the time John's gospel is written, about 70, 80 years after Jesus' death, it is believed that Greek zoologists felt that there were 153 different types of fish in the world, which then in John's symbolism represents the idea that the Christian spiritual path, the Christian tradition, is meant to be open and inclusive of all types of fish. Fish throughout the Gospels often symbolic of people. Inclusive, open to all types of people. Okay? Nice. Nice. They catch all those fish. And in the catching of those fish, just like in Luke's gospel, it triggers a recognition. In Luke's gospel, it triggers this recognition that that figure on the shore is not just some ordinary guy. In John's gospel, it triggers the recognition that they are once again in the presence of the risen Jesus. And upon that recognition, Peter, we're told, puts on his clothes and jumps into the water. Again, what's up with that? Well, again, in that time and place, it was common for people to fish naked. Why? Well, because in that time and place, the vast majority of people did not exactly have wardrobes. They had one or two sets of clothes at most. And so people fished naked in order to preserve the clothes that they had, especially when they were engaged in such a messy and smelly occupation. Peter recognizes that they are once again in the presence of the risen Jesus. He throws on his clothes and jumps into the water. Many theologians believe that he throws on his clothes in that way because he does not want to appear naked before the risen Jesus. Naked, like he was spiritually, ethically, morally naked on the night before Jesus' death when he denied even knowing Jesus. Well, finally, the gang's all together. All 7 disciples make it to the shore, and they are in the presence, once again, of the risen Jesus. The risen Jesus, who is wearing, well, not wearing this. Not wearing this. Despite the fact that he had every reason to. He's not wearing this. Not once does Jesus express or attempt to make the disciples feel or believe that they are a disappointment to him. Of course, he was disappointed in the things that they did and did not do. But at no time does he express or make them try to believe or feel that they are a disappointment to him. Instead, he says, hey, how about breakfast? Make some breakfast. Serves it. Not a single word about them being a disappointment to him. How? How was he able to do that? I don't think I could. Well, there's that whole Son of God thing, of course. Jesus as the Son, the embodiment of God and God's ways. And there is not a single instance, not one, in the entire Bible, where God expresses or attempts to make any person or group feel or believe that they are a disappointment to God. And believe me, you know God had plenty of reason. Sure, there's times constantly throughout the Bible where God had to have been disappointed with the things that people and groups did, but there is not a single time when God expresses or attempts to make a person or group feel or believe that they are a disappointment. Disappointment as disciples, a disappointment as people. But I also want to suggest today that maybe it wasn't just because Jesus was God's son, but also because he was Mary's. Because there's not a single time in the Gospels where Mary expresses or tries to make Jesus feel or believe that he is a disappointment to her. And you go, well, duh. Of course not. He's Jesus. Son of God thing again. But see, a couple of things. The first is that there's only one of the four Gospels in which Mary really knows who Jesus is and is destined to become. Just one where that's clear, Luke's Gospel. In Matthew's Gospel, Joseph is the one who gets the inclination, and it's really not even a full picture. But in Mark's Gospel, and in this one, John's Gospel, nothing. There's no indication at all that Mary knows who and what her son is or is destined to become. So there's that. And then, of course, there's the fact that in our tradition, we understand Jesus to have also been fully human. And there are times in the Gospels where that fully human Jesus, as the expression goes, did some stuff. Some stuff that Mary, understandably, might have been disappointed with. You know, like the time in Luke's Gospel where, as a 12-year-old boy, he stays behind in the temple in Jerusalem after Passover while Mary and Joseph head back to Nazareth, only to realize 3 days later that he ain't with them. And now they got to backtrack 3 days to retrieve him. Tell me that wasn't disappointing? And then there's the adult Jesus. The adult Jesus who walks away from being the tradesman that he most likely was, because that's what Joseph was, walks away from being the tradesman that he was to go out as a wandering rabbi. When as the oldest son, the expectation, the obligation would have been for him to stay home and take care, look after Mary. Because by that time, the Gospels are pretty clear that Joseph has been out of the picture for a while. And then there's The stuff that he does as that wandering rabbi, stuff that he and Mary both know are going to put him at risk. Put him at risk of great harm, if not death. As a very human mother, Mary would have understandably been disappointed with some of those things. But at no time, not once, does she express or try to make Jesus feel or believe that he is a disappointment to her as a son or as a human being. And that matters. Because a body of research also suggests that the feeling or belief that we are a disappointment to others, particularly significant others, that can lead to a whole host of emotional and mental and social and spiritually harmful consequences. Like a reduced, a diminished sense of self-worth, a resistance to trying new things or pursuing goals. It can sabotage relationships, make intimacy almost impossible, and, more pertinent to this scene, this discussion, it can lead us to be unable to trust in the love and forgiveness that others offer us. What a gift. What a gift that is to give to another. Like Mary gave it to Jesus. I had a mother like that. Maybe you did too. But regardless, I hope, I pray that each and every one of us has had at least one woman in our lives, a mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, mother figure, one woman in our lives who gave us that awesome gift. Who, despite the things that we did or said that may have been disappointing to them, never expressed or tried to make us feel or believe that we were a disappointment to them. The same way that Mary gave that gift to Jesus, the same way that God gives that gift to us, and the same way that Jesus gave that gift to his disciples and to us. So I guess given all that, as much as I like this t-shirt, and I really, really like this t-shirt, I guess I probably shouldn't wear it. Because Jesus wouldn't. What a disappointment. Amen. I invite you to stand for